since October 7th, there were blanket bans brought in. People were kicked out of school for wearing keffiyeh. The slogan "From the river to the sea" has been treated as a terrorist slogan. So it's actually illegal under the same law as saying Heil Hitler.
Welcome to The Tea with me, Myriam François. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of The Tea. If you want to support the show and help shape future episodes, join our Patreon community. Think of it as the resistance. Plus, if you're in our top tier, you'll get access to ad-free episodes. The link's in our bio. Today, we're talking about Germany, Europe's biggest economy, a founding EU member, and home to the EU's second largest military. Its defence budget is set to more than double by 2029, reaching over 150 billion euros annually, marking a historic break from decades of post-war restraint. But behind this power lies deep contradictions. Germany carries the weight of never again from the Holocaust, yet stands as Europe's strongest supporter of Israel amid ongoing genocide in Gaza. That history is weaponized to silence anyone saying never again for anyone. In October this year, the UN urged Germany to stop criminalizing, punishing, and suppressing legitimate Palestinian solidarity. At the same time, anti-Semitism and racism are rising, mostly by far-right extremists, now the largest source of anti-Semitic attacks and reportedly infiltrating the military. The Holocaust's memory is used to justify unwavering backing of Israel, even when it undermines international law, increases authoritarianism at home, and erases Palestinian suffering. In Germany today, chanting "From the river to the sea" is banned, as is boycotting Israeli products. Some politicians have gone further to propose making support for Israel a requirement for German citizenship. Leading human rights groups warn this resembles authoritarianism. And let's not forget, 4 of Germany's 10 richest families built wealth from Holocaust-era profiteering. So, has Germany truly faced its past? To help unpack this, I'm joined by James Jackson, British journalist and award-winning documentary filmmaker based in Berlin, who appears on the BBC, Al Jazeera, and hosts the podcast Mad in Germany. James has witnessed firsthand the tensions in a nation grappling with history, power, and its global role. And you've probably seen him tweet all about it. James, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you were working for Deutsche Welle, which is one of Germany's biggest broadcasters, but you ended up in some hot water recently. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was a few years ago now, but ultimately, I stopped working there because they did have some issues with some of my social media, in particular one tweet where I was calling out Volkswagen, the car company, for some of its kind of historical crimes. When they were tweeting proudly about their heritage, their proud heritage, I, pointed out their logo, which was basically a swastika, their first logo, with a cog around it.
VW's logo was a swastika?
It was a swastika with a cog around it because they were originally formed as part of like the National Labour Front, it was called, something like that. So, during the war, they used a lot of slave labour, including from concentration camps. And, I tweeted about that. Someone kind of passed my tweet to a manager. I got in a lot of hot water about that. And I was told even, don't you think, number one, Volkswagen wouldn't like that? Personally, I think as a journalist, that you should be reminding these companies of their crimes, especially if it's not well known like
Absolutely.
This one. And also because I had used the swastika logo, in a context, in the particular historical context, I was told, don't you think that could be anti-Semitic? To call out a Nazi company, a company founded by the Nazis in part, for using slave labor, including Jewish slave labor from concentration camps. So that kind of made me realize at that point, a few years ago now, there was something going on.
So that was your kind of moment of realizing that maybe this country that has for so long been touted as, really learning from these horrors that it committed in its recent past, I think it's a narrative many of us bought into. I remember years ago watching Trevor Noah, do a comedy sketch around this and just being like, wow, like Germany's amazing, like Berlin's amazing. This is a country that's really done the work. They've paid the reparations, they've unpicked it all and created a new society that has learned to recognize its faults. But from where you're standing, how accurate a description of Germany is that today?
I really think that we've seen in the last few years a kind of climax of the contradictions or heightening of the contradictions in German identity. And in a sense, it's made me think, is it possible to come to terms with your past? And is that even desirable if what it leads to is this kind of repression and repressed guilt and repressed identity? So I don't know. I'm not a philosopher. It's not necessarily my place. But I will say there was a philosopher who wrote a book learning from the Germans. And she wrote, the kind of narrative about how Germany had faced its past. And then just a few years later, she disowned the book because she said, actually, I see in the suppression of Palestinian voices that I was wrong. So Susan Neiman, her name is, still based in Berlin. She's Jewish and critical of Israel without necessarily being anti-Zionist. And I think actually, in her case, that's really instructive, and it's got much worse since she disowned it. So there was this resolution about banning BDS, which is when she realised that's kind of actually, you can see some of the same historical problems which caused the Nazis still present in German society, but the target has changed. I think the thing that's quite unique about Germany and the German elite is they've built their new identity on turning away from their past. And I'm not even convinced that that's a good thing, because ultimately it's a redemption narrative, right? And it's been called guilt pride. So you no longer are proud about what your nation's done. You're proud about how evil your nation was and how you've accepted that. So Susan Neiman, again, in a recent interview, she was comparing, Gaza and Nazi crimes on a historical level, but actually she was called out as a Jewish person. She was called out by the interviewer. Don't you think you're comparing German crimes there? And the discourse is so restricted about what you can and cannot say, because you all have to sing from the same hymn sheet, which was that the Holocaust was this unique evil, and you cannot compare it, and comparing it to anything is evil. So you're almost, you all have to say that we cannot learn from our history because we cannot compare.
And so do you think that the consequence of that is a sort of an exceptionalism around the events that occurred that, because I suppose if you're looking at the response to the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the protests against that have occurred in Germany, it does feel like cognitive dissonance for those of us observing it. We're like, hold on, you guys learnt the lessons from history? Explain this.
Since October 7th, there were blanket bans brought in. People were kicked out of school for wearing keffiyehs. Particularly keffiyehs have been problematized. The slogan "From the River to the Sea" has been treated as a terrorist slogan. So it's actually illegal under the same law as saying Heil Hitler, because that's support for a terrorist group, Hamas. Now, anyone who knows anything about the conflict will know that this slogan has very little to do with Hamas. It's not a Hamas slogan. They have their own slogans. It's completely different. But what we see is the German state has, at every level, moved everything so that it can continue to suppress Palestinian solidarity. And it's not just the UN that's called this out. Actually, the European Commission in particular called out police violence. And so this is another thing that I think people weren't quite aware of. In Germany, police violence is very much more normalized, and it's really hard to prosecute the police for doing something, even, just punching a woman in the face. There was a lot of clips have gone around in the last couple of years on social media, and you see the police just walking up to someone, pushing them into like a police van or onto the floor. Quite often, big men, muscly men, attacking women, attacking minors, detaining minors. There's obviously kind of a racial element there because they are mostly white and the people they attack are often people of colour. But there's also, footage of German police punching Jews in the face. A Jewish activist, I know, Udi Braz, was arrested because they called out a German police officer for anti-Semitism because the police officer was mocking them for their watermelon kippah. So it's, pro-Palestine, like Jewish religious hat. And they said that they were mocking them for that. And then they said that's anti-Semitic, but that is a criminal offense to insult someone. So you can see in Germany, even giving someone the middle finger, you can go to jail for that. There's even cases where the police have saying the informal you, like du, like tu in French, is actually something that you can be convicted for. So what we see is a country where the state has so much more power than you realize and than is normal in the US, in the UK, in other parts. So the state has always had a lot of power in Germany, but, there's been almost an agreement that they're not going to overreach. And I think the Gaza conflict is something that's given them the perfect excuse to act like fascists because they're doing it to protect the Jews, but actually in many cases, the people they are attacking are themselves anti-Zionist Jews. And according to the police president of Berlin, which is the focal point for this because there's a huge Palestinian diaspora there, there's more international people, they've just redefined anti-Semitism to be something that Jews can do to Germans. And I think personally that's, has a really twisted logic, but I think that can lead to really dangerous things. And as we've seen many times in history, Germany takes these things too far, whether it was, fascism or even communism or witch hunts or whatever, religious reforms. In Germany, there's a certain groupthink and moralism, which means that things get taken to the extreme. And I personally think this is increasingly dangerous.
So we've also seen repression occurring here of, Palestine solidarity. You'll probably be aware that the Home Office officially prescribed Palestine Action as a terrorist organization under the Terrorism Act, making even support for the group today a criminal offence in the UK. We also saw attacks on pro-Palestinian solidarity in the US, people being deported, etc. What would you say is distinct about the kind of repression that you're observing in Germany? And why does it matter to anyone outside of Germany?
Mm-hmm. I mean, in Germany, it's not just about police repression. That is something that's quite visible. You can see, images going around of police brutality. But it's almost every level of society has been recruited into this project of anti-Palestinian repression. So, it's not just the police. It's also citizenship being linked to Israel. In a number of East German states, you actually do have to already say that you agree with Israel's right to exist to get German citizenship. People are deported for whether it's, expressing support for Hamas or just something which the German state considers to be that, including, from the river to the sea. We also see lots of Jewish philosophers and artists have had their prize events. Masha Gessen or Candice Bright or Adam Broomberg have been kind of repressed by different elements of the state. They have this kind of bloated anti-Semitism bureaucracy. So each state has its own anti-Semitism commissioners. So I think really they've rallied all aspects, local government, universities, into this hyper-Zionism, which the population don't really agree with, and which justifies repression, which, as you said, the UN and also the EU Commission has called out. And I think we're going to be seeing more of it. Actually, I was expecting things to slow down after a ceasefire in Gaza, but there's absolutely no sign of that. And I think there's really like a disconnect between the population and the elite. And I personally think, when the German elite gets too powerful and too radical, because we have seen radicalization, that can cause all kinds of problems, not just in Germany, but, it could spread across its borders. And of course, there's also the question of material support for Israel and undermining international law. So Germany, in the 90s and 2000s, was a key supporter of the International Criminal Court. It still funds it to this day. But the new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, the first day he came into office, he effectively invited Benjamin Netanyahu to visit Germany, despite the International Criminal Warrant for Netanyahu for crimes against humanity and war crimes.
So if the state in Germany today isn't about combating anti-Semitism as you and I might understand it, right? Violence or hatred towards Jewish people. What is the anti-Semitism it claims to be fighting actually about?
Ultimately, it's about whipping up support for Israel. People talk about the IHRA definition. I think, there are some problems with that. But in Germany, I wish that was the common definition, because they actually use, in many cases, the 3D definition, which was actually set up by a minister, someone who became a minister under Netanyahu, like a Likud politician, which means you can't demonize Israel, you can't delegitimize it. And, many people would say Israel's demonized and delegitimized itself, right? Because of committing so many horrific war crimes. I mean, this is somewhere where 2 of the leaders are wanted by the ICC. This is not like a normal state, right? It's delegitimized itself, according to many people. But ultimately, the anti-Semitism bureaucracy, because it's not just commissioners, it's also a lot of NGOs. So I was recently sued by an NGO for breach of copyright because I screenshotted an article where they talked about the keffiyeh as a symbol of Jew hatred or terror against Jews. And this is something which, I'm paying my taxes for that. And I'm also paying for the taxes for the case against me. So ultimately, they're using the language of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is, of course, like a unique evil, I think. And it is a horrific, especially when you look at how it was used in the past in Germany to create a justification for the annihilation of Jews, as well as the invasion of the Soviet Union, where many, many millions were killed. And now they're using it to justify, killing many in Gaza, as well as repression of people, including Jews, but also largely Muslims and other minorities at home. So it kind of gives them the perfect excuse. And I think that's worrying.
I wanted to ask you about this idea that basically to be a good German, to be a patriot means to support Israel. I think that'll be quite confusing to a lot of people. Can you help us understand this? I mean, I remember in a visit to Israel after October the 7th, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said, in difficult times, Germany has only one place by Israel's side. We've heard various statements. Angela Merkel told the Israeli Knesset that Israel's security is part of Germany's raison d'être.
Staatsräson, they call it, yeah.
Can you explain why Germany's reason for being would be Israel?
It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, this idea of Staatsräson, reason of state, is kind of this pre-democratic idea, actually. It's not one that's used in political theory very often. But if you have one, then it's the existence of your own state. Whereas Germany has kind of redefined itself as always linked to Israel. And the reason that Germany exists partly is to defend Israel. So, considering Israel hasn't been around for that long, I think that is quite strange. And considering everything we've seen, do we really want Europe's biggest country sort of linked forever with Israel, despite the fact that, whatever you think of the early days of Israel, it's going on a path where it's radicalizing much further and, starting wars with many of its neighbors. Do we really want Germany to be linked to that? Now, this idea of a reason of state is very controversial, and it's one that's not even found in the Constitution, right? It's not found anywhere other than political speech. After Merkel made that speech to the Knesset, I believe it was 2008, there were people who wrote to, a lot of MPs wrote to the Bundestag in her office and said, listen, what does this mean? Because this is news to me. But this is one of those cases where it was such a catchy phrase that it kind of became reality. And I think, and because it's not codified, that means you can't challenge it. And I think that's actually very worrying, because ultimately Germany's meant to be a constitutional democracy. They have this idea that they're patriotic, not about the country, but about the constitution, Verfassungspatriotismus it's called. And it comes from, a well-known philosopher. And then it's almost been sacrificed, this idea, at the altar of Staatsräson, or of German Zionism, ultimately. And I would go as far as to say, in some cases, the Staatsräson for elements of the German elite has become the new Führer principle, which is this idea which existed under Hitler that, okay, you have the law, but the most important thing is the Führer is right. And what we've seen in Germany is actually the idea that we've got the law, but what matters is we have to support Israel. And we've seen many cases of the German state breaking the law, including banning a Palestine conference, including the ban against Hassan Abu Sittah, the British Palestinian doctor who was meant to go there. That was recently defined as illegal. There was also the closing of the bank accounts of the Jüdische Stimme, the Jewish Voice in Germany. It was illegally frozen. So there's many cases where Germany has gone beyond its own law. There's this idea that Germans are law-abiding people, right? I think, sadly, that's not true. There's always something above the law, and that now is the Staatsräson for certain sections of the state and the elite.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, James, the German constitution is being undermined by German Zionism, even at the cost of actual anti-Semitism against people it claims to defend? If you're enjoying the show, why not join our Patreon community? The Tea is more than a YouTube show. It's a space to foster meaningful change together. By becoming a member, you're supporting that mission. And if you join our top tier, you'll get exclusive ad-free episodes too. So join us now, link in our bio.
I absolutely believe that. And I think that is, shocking and worrying. But ultimately, the German constitution is a very good document. It says number one point is all humans should have dignity. Well, I'm sorry, but how does banning, solidarity movements against what scholarly consensus says is a genocide, how does that fit with human dignity? And of course, I see a lot of German discourse because I speak the language, and the way that they talk about Muslims and Palestinians is very twisted. And there's always this approach to try and link the Palestinians, particularly with the Nazis, because historically there was a Palestinian leader who was not particularly meaningful or significant. And he joined the SS at one point and worked to produce propaganda for Hitler. And there's this historical revisionist idea which blames Palestinians for the Nazis. And, Netanyahu has actually mentioned this idea before. So ultimately, I think, sadly, the German elite is giving up on their own constitution, is giving up on their own rule of law, which is supposed to be something that's very important, so that they can push a very extreme vision of Zionism. It's not even liberal Zionism. It is, in many cases, for material support for Netanyahu and diplomatic support. And I think this destabilizes the whole world, including the West. If you want to criticize the West, that's fine. But I do think that Germany, by undermining international law, is destabilizing Europe and the West, and in other aspects as well. It's not just about Zionism. As you mentioned, there's the rise of the far right, there's the remilitarization. All of this stuff is happening at the same time. And ultimately, I think we should be concerned about that.
Has this precedence being given to Israel almost over and above the interests of German people always been the case? Is it a founding principle?
Yeah, I don't think it was a founding principle at all. Actually, the first chancellor of post-war Germany, Konrad Adenauer, when he was asked in a television interview, why do you support Israel? He said, well, even today, the Jews are still very powerful.
Oh, well, I've got the quote, and I was going to ask you about this. So in a 1966 interview on German television, former German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who you just mentioned, said, and I quote, "We had done to the Jews so much injustice, committed such crimes against them that somehow these had to be expiated or repaired. If we were at all to regain our international standing, the power of the Jews, even today, especially in America, should not be underestimated." I mean, to me, that quote is actually insane. Right?
It's anti-Semitic. Right?
Is it not?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it is. And no one ever, Konrad Adenauer is seen as the founding father of post-war Germany. He's the founder of the CDU, which is kind of the ruling party. It's like the Tories in the UK or the Republicans. And he made that anti-Semitic statement. And also a big part of his project was this reconciliation with the old Nazis. He saw that Germany's future was with the West. And he decided, we're going to need good generals, we're going to need good judges. And so we keep the ones we have, even though they had been sending, Jews to concentration camps, political prisoners, and, committing massacres. And so I think that was the original sin of post-war Germany. And I don't think they've come to terms with that. I think ultimately the German approach for dealing with history was to say we were all guilty as a nation. And in a sense, that means none of us are guilty, right?
I've heard this argument before. If everyone's guilty, no one's guilty, right? How do you actually then, you kind of make people take individual accountability? let me ask you about Samidoun, also known as the Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. It's a Palestinian group active internationally, including in Germany. It advocates for the rights and liberation of Palestinian prisoners who are once again in the headlines because of the horrific torture currently being endured in Israeli prisons, including multiple instances of rape. But in November 2023, Germany's Federal Ministry of the Interior banned all of its activities. So given the horrors that we're seeing Palestinian prisoners endure, how does Germany justify shutting down an organization that is engaged in advocacy for those people?
Well, I think in Samidoun's case, there is a particular reason in Germany, which you may or may not agree with, but I think it makes more sense in the German context, which is that after October 7th attack, Samidoun members were involved in giving out baklava as a celebration on Sonnenallee, which is like the Palestinian street in Berlin. So that was very controversial, and I personally think rightly so. There's this debate about whether they knew, the extent of what had happened, including the war crimes which happened. So actually, I think that ban, people might understand it a bit more than some of the other groups which have been banned. I mean, Jüdische Stimme, Jewish Voice have been not banned, but counted as extremists. And now their members aren't able to speak at universities because they're an official extremist group. You have to realize the way the state works in Germany is that they say because of our Nazi history, we have to be more proactive and infringe on freedom of speech so that the Nazis don't come back. But of course, what that means is in many cases they ban, Muslim or Jewish or leftist groups, disproportionately far-right groups are also in many cases banned. But they seem to get a lot further when it comes to plotting to overthrow the state or stealing weapons. And, that's not really something that happens with other groups. Whereas it's a constant scandal in Germany that some far-right group has, got a lot of ammunition which they've stolen from the army.
You quote on one of your tweets, German-Israeli Jewish activist Iris Heffetz, who was arrested for holding a sign saying, and I quote, "Zionism kills." And she said, "We Jews are just getting arrested. The Palestinians are being beaten." You sort of touched on this already, but this is a country that, for all intents and purposes, built its modern identity on the idea that it was going to protect the very community that it had been involved in exterminating. So how are, Jewish Germans or Jewish people in Germany who are protesting against the genocide being treated? Does it reflect the concern that, Germany might be expected to have toward them?
Absolutely not. Sadly, Germany has kind of sacrificed the idea of protecting Jewish life on the altar of Zionism, I'm afraid to say, because Jewish people have a lot of diversity, particularly on this, probably a majority do support Israel, but there's a very loud and very vocal minority that doesn't. And Germany has basically said, well, it's a minority position, and we don't. And actually, Jews can be anti-Semitic as well, right? And as I mentioned earlier, Jews can be anti-Semitic to the German police. Which is so crazy because one thing that Germany hasn't grappled with is that the German police were involved in the Holocaust, right? Particularly the Holocaust by bullets. So often there's this idea that it was all the SS, but actually almost all levels of the German state were involved. And now Germans, they trust the state to define what's anti-Semitic, which is deeply problematic. And then they watch silently as Jews are arrested and in some cases beaten. Palestinians face it much worse, I think, and repressed and banned. And this whole idea that you're supposed to have, it's called Zivilcourage. You're meant to stand up against anti-Semitism. And Germany, most Germans have been completely silent. And actually the people who've been stepping up to stop and to protest repression of anti-Zionist Jews have mostly been foreigners, including many Muslims, including, migrants to Berlin. So I think Germany is in the midst of another kind of frenzy, which we saw a kind of racist frenzy, and we don't know how it's going to end. I don't think it's going to go as far as last time, but I really see historical parallels between what's happening now and, maybe the late days of the Weimar Republic.
That's a very bold statement. I'd love to hear about it in also relation to, I'm observing a country where, the UN rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, was, prescribed from speaking at an event. I'm seeing, the ban on boycotting products, which surely as a consumer, you get to decide which products you wish to swerve at the very least before you even become a citizen who has the right to make political choices. The free speech aspects, you mentioned from the river to the sea, but I guess, also some of the comments that have been made with regards to Zionism being interpreted as anti-Semitism and then, the result being repression, all of this seems to be building a picture of a country that is, I don't want to say veering towards authoritarianism, but certainly swerving hard. How would you describe the current situation? Are we sort of, flirting with authoritarianism? Are we far more advanced than you might expect? And, to what extent are there historical parallels for this moment?
I do think we are deeper into German authoritarianism than is comfortable to admit, actually. As a reporter, I cover this stuff, and there's something that happens every day, right? Almost every day, at least it feels like it. In regards to the BDS movement, I mean, this is a really clear example because they say that BDS is just the new Kauf nicht bei dem Juden, which was this boycott campaign that the Nazis had against the Jews, right? Don't buy in Jewish shops. So even though BDS is absolutely nothing like that, right? And many supporters of BDS are Jewish, but it shows how willing they are to twist history into making it comfortable for Germans. And it shows that it's not really about Jews at all. It's not really about Israel. Ultimately, it's about German self-image and about how they feel. Now, Francesca Albanese, I was actually at her event, right? And we were standing there, small group in a room not that much bigger than this, a couple times bigger than this one, and there were very heavily armored German police in there, and the organizers asked, why are the police here? You watch it on live stream. If someone says something illegal, then you can come in, because that's the justification. If someone says something illegal, you can come in. The police said, well, we're not just interested in people saying illegal things on stage, right? We're also interested in people in the crowd if they say something illegal, like from the river to the sea, like, fuck Zionism, which has been treated as illegal. Or another Jewish protester held up a sign saying, another Jew for free Palestine. They were arrested because the police said, what if it means we'll kill another Jew for a free Palestine? There's a certain way that the justice system is completely willing to manipulate truth so that they can enforce Zionism. And when you look at the police, and there are links between the police and the far-right AfD, I think this is deeply worrying that they're no longer sticking to law and order, but taking it another step further. And just to come on to the historical parallels, I think that's where it gets kind of interesting because, I don't think there is a new Hitler around the corner. And I do think Hitler did have a very key role in radicalizing German society. But the conditions were already there. At the time, there was inflation, dissatisfaction with political parties in the Weimar Republic in the 20s and early 30s, and, threats on the border or perceived threats on the borders. And I think right now in Germany, we see the highest inflation since then, actually, which has led to the rise of the far right in large part. So for quite a while at this point, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is the far right party, have been number one in the polls. Chancellor Friedrich Merz, when he became leader of the CDU, he said, we want to halve them. Actually, he's doubled them. They've doubled their vote share at this point, and they've also further radicalized. And the centre-right and the centre-left have kind of followed them by saying, okay, maybe we do need to deport more. Maybe we do need to bash migrants more, Scholz, who was from the SPD, said last year, we need to start deporting in grand style. So there's a dehumanizing narrative around immigrants, which is linked to the anti-Semitism discourse, because the idea is, we Germans, we're not anti-Semites. The migrants, we're importing anti-Semitism. That gets said by senior figures all the time. I just think, the country that committed the Holocaust, within living memory, right? I've interviewed Holocaust survivors. I do believe it was the worst crime in history, And the fact that they talk about importing anti-Semitism when actually denazification was a complete farce. It basically didn't happen. And this whole memory culture around the Holocaust only really started in the 80s and 90s, after this debate between historians. And then it doesn't have that much buy-in from the population. And many of the biggest supporters of this memory culture are kind of authoritarian figures who have clapped on and applauded the oppression of anti-Zionist Jews and Muslims and Palestinians and their supporters, many of whom are white European migrants and even Germans, although they're quite quiet. So I do see a lot of issues here. And then at the same time, Germany is remilitarizing. So, I don't want to be alarmist about this. I don't want to say like Germany's going to be committing a genocide again in the next 10 years. But while we're talking about German history, an activist from a group called Germans Against Genocide actually said to me recently something which has stuck with me. Out of 4, Germany hasn't been around for that long. It's about 150, 170 years as a state, right? It was previously a lot of, Prussia and Bavaria and all of these places. Since Germany's existed, across the last 4 generations, Germans have been involved in at least 4 genocides. Each generation has been involved in a genocide. I mean, there's the Gaza genocide. There's, of course, the Holocaust. There was also a genocide of Roma and Sinti, of Polish people, other Slavs as well. Before that, there was the Herero and Nama in Namibia, which started as like an anti-colonial uprising. There was a massacre of a German village, and then Germany sent the troops in from the mainland, and they just drove them to the desert. So that wiped out 80% of the Herero and Nama. Germany was quite deeply involved in the Armenian genocide, which most people aren't aware of. The Kaiserreich, so the Imperial Germany, was involved in providing, logistical support for the Ottoman, Turkish genocide against the Armenians. So it does make you wonder what's gone wrong with this country that across 4 generations, every generation has been involved in genocide. And I do think it's this moralism, it's this groupthink, it's this idea that they're always right and that if you disagree with them, you're wrong and you're evil somehow. And they've twisted that so that now they see their past selves as evil, but this time they're right again. And they are, the ones who can enforce what is good. And I think this is very much an elite phenomenon, not among the normal people. But that's a very extreme form of Zionism.
Do you have a sense of where this notion that, to be truly German today is to be a Zionist, that, to defend Germany is to defend Israel, that the immigrants are the real source of Germany's troubles and of any anti-Semitism, aka of source of any evil? Do you have any sense of where that discourse is coming from?
I think it's racism, right? It's this idea that what's foreign is bad. But there's a very good book called Subcontractors of Guilt by academic Ezra Özürek, which says that Germany kind of subcontracts its guilt on the Nazis onto Muslims and particularly Arabs, but the book's actually more about Turks. And there was this idea, which, as I mentioned before, that the Palestinians were deeply linked with the Nazis, but also that Islam is the new form of Nazism, right? So that's kind of an interesting parallel or reflection to the previous idea in Germany during the Nazi times, which was Judeo-Bolshevism. So there was this idea that there was a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, and that was why they needed to launch World War II in the East, particularly because that was the hub. But now, among sections of the centre, they have a very illiberal centre, and I think that's a really underreported kind of aspect of the problems there. There's this idea on the right and the illiberal centre that there's this kind of Islamic, leftist, anti-Semitic conspiracy that's coming into Germany and trying to, brainwash innocent Germans and importing anti-Semitism. Germany's not a great place to be a migrant. I mean, it has a great economy, but there was a study that came out over the summer. 1 in 4 migrants is actually thinking quite seriously about leaving Germany. And, I post about this on social media, and a lot of people message me saying, I've tried to be here. I've tried to integrate. I speak the language, but I still don't get treated as German. So why should I treat myself?
Yeah, and of course, didn't this recently lead to a bit of a crisis in the medical sector, where a lot of nurses I was reading who are often migrants are basically trying to leave, and they're trying to find policies to make people stay that seem to be very confused about why people would want to leave. Don't know if you came across this study. Basically, it was interviewing migrants around why they were leaving the National Health Service and trying to find ways to convince them to stay. And I thought the biggest irony of what I was reading was not once was it kind of approached that maybe the environment that they were in might not be very conducive.
I mean, basically, Germany, like a lot of countries, has a shortage of workers because it's an aging society. And so they do need like specialist workers and manual workers and whatever from around the world, right? But many of them go to Germany. I think it was in the Philippines specifically. They tried to recruit and spent a lot of money on recruiting nurses. And, they all left because they said it's too racist. So I think people underestimate the extent, and especially Germans underestimate the extent to which it is a very, very racist country. In terms of anti-black racism, along with Austria, it's number 1 in Europe, according to an EU study. In terms of anti-Muslim racism, I believe it was also number 1. And when you speak to Germans about this, they say, "Oh, come on! Well, we don't have Jim Crow," and they're still talking about what happened in the US in the 1960s to justify like how anti-black racism isn't really a thing. I mean, you don't have many black people in Germany, and a lot of Germans were quite proud supporters of Black Lives Matter because it was a way of waving the finger at the US and racism there, but have real issues with denying how much racism there is in the country. I mean, objectively, it's one of the most racist countries in Europe for black people, for Muslims, and, Muslims are a large part of society there. There's this idea Germany hasn't really got the civic nationalism that, the UK, the US, France does. And it's still, being German is still a kind of ethnic identity. I hope that could change. But then there are a lot of people who say, well, actually, why would I want to be German? There is all this discourse about if you're being German means accepting historical guilt. And what they don't say is that means accepting Israel's right to kill as many people as it wants. So, what does being German mean? And I don't think they can say that other than the blood and soil. And I think that is actually scary, especially considering, Germany's past when we look at what racism there leads to.
Now, let me ask you about this rise of the far right, which obviously is, the elephant in the room on the backdrop of all of this, because, of course, Israel's government is also far right. And you're talking about a country today, Germany, which is seeing a huge surge in the far right, the AfD, which is a party that has long been considered fringe, but is today first in the polls. The AfD caught the attention of the Trump administration earlier this year. J.D. Vance met with the leader of the AfD, which was, breaking a taboo, as it were, in German politics of not interacting with far-right groups. An advisor to Trump said that the MAGA movement and the AfD are together in a spiritual war for the soul of our nations against Marxists and globalists. And he even called them bold visionaries. What impact would you say the MAGA movement has had on the rise and consolidation of the far right, and in particular the AfD in Germany today?
Of course, Elon Musk was a huge backer of the AfD, and he runs X, which is such an influential social media platform. He said AfD is the solution for Germany. I think what the MAGA movement has done, more than causing any rise in support, because I think that's about domestic factors like inflation, there has been a lot of terrorism in recent years, with much of that linked to former asylum seekers and stuff. But I think what they've done is normalize the AfD. And in Germany, there's this idea of a firewall against the far right. You don't cooperate with the AfD in any way. And that is crumbling quite slowly. Friedrich Merz helped it crumble when he voted alongside them on an anti-immigration bill earlier this year. But I think one element that's gone underreported is the largest media company in Europe, which is the Axel Springer company. And they have quietly been testing the grounds since about June for a cooperation between the CDU and the AfD. So one issue in Germany, it's a proportional representation system. What that has meant in the last 20 or so years, 24 years, most of the coalition governments have actually been a centre-right and centre-left. So it's the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. Now, under Merkel, that worked quite well because Merkel wasn't so far from the Social Democrats at the time. But under Friedrich Merz, who's a much more right-wing figure than Merkel, he was her long-term rival, right? In the early days, in the late 90s and the 2000s, she kind of pipped him to the post of Chancellor. And ultimately, there is a lot of dissatisfaction with this coalition in the population and even inside the coalition. And the most powerful media company, it's like the News Corp, the Murdoch press of Germany, of Europe, because it owns media in Poland, elsewhere as well. It also owns Politico in the US and the EU. And they've been testing the grounds for a minority government supported by the AfD. So I think that would be the kind of next step in the crumbling of the firewall. And then ultimately, actually, if the AfD are number one at the next election, will it be a minority government supporting, like they have in Sweden at the moment? The Sweden Democrats support the Conservative government. How long until we have an AfD-led government? As I said earlier, I don't think there is a kind of new Hitler on the horizon. But I do think Alice Weidel, who's the kind of main leader of the AfD, I do think she's a pretty talented politician. She's a lesbian, has a kind of posh banker vibe. And I think she lives in Switzerland. I think she's helped to normalize the party, which has two different wings, West and East. And, the West wing is kind of like right-wing conservatives, a bit more like Reform. But then the Eastern wing has some real ethno-nationalists in there who support Russia, or at least are very soft on Russia. And I wonder where that's going to lead. They do also play with kind of Nazi slogans. One of the key leaders in the East has been convicted twice for using a Nazi-era slogan. He did it as a kind of sing-song thing. He said alles for, everything for, and got his crowd to chant back Deutschland, Germany. So the fact that they're so willing to play with this Nazi rhetoric is quite worrying.
Well, it's very worrying, but it's also really shocking to hear when you compare that with the levels of repression that we are seeing on protests, say, against a genocide, that it seems to be a kind of laxness around the reproduction of Nazi ideas and symbols, which should be worrying for all of us. I'm concerned when I look at Germany because, in France, we've had, for example, Le Pen's party come second basically in every election pretty much in my lifetime. And that we also had this principle in France similar to the one you described of, the bulwark against the far right. So if, Le Pen gets to the second round or, her party gets to the second round, that everyone coalesces against the other candidate. But that's also crumbling. And the picture that's building across Europe is of these far right groups on the ascent. Trump's former White House strategist, Steve Bannon, was recently being interviewed by The Economist. I don't know if you caught this, but he essentially was describing what he considers to be a nationalist surge sweeping across Europe from the AfD to Le Pen in France. And, he sort of spoke very glowingly about how this is reshaping the continent's political landscape. If we broaden out from, just German politics, but you look at this in the context of Europe and where Europe is heading, what do you think we should be attentive to in terms of what this may mean, the implications of this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not just Germany where the far right is rising. That's a cross-European phenomenon amid, I believe, it's inflation and aging populations, dissatisfaction with the kind of migration that's probably needed to keep the economies going. Ultimately, I think what we should keep an eye out for, as well as domestic repression, because as we've seen from the German centre, we've seen almost unprecedented repression against the Palestine movement. But I wonder what will happen to that centre if the far right take over. They've actually set up the perfect system for crushing political opposition across all aspects of society. I believe we are starting to see that in the US already, right? With law firms, with universities having to bow to the state and to Trump specifically. There is no German Trump. There's no Le Pen even. The AfD is a bit more amorphous, but as I said, I do think Alice Weidel is quite an impressive political figure. She's doing them some favours. I wonder, though, apart from domestic repression, what this could mean for geopolitics, right? I mean, we are starting to see Germany set to double its military budget. For a long time, they didn't spend very much on the military. Actually, it's quite ridiculous how bad their military got, in a sense. They had radar equipment in the Bundeswehr that their allies would refuse to communicate with because it was so easily hacked, right? I do cover defense as well. And there was a litany of complaints. But do we really want to see Germany armed to the teeth when the AfD take over with this new-ish apparatus of domestic repression? I should also mention that the head of the domestic intelligence recently quit to run for the CDU, right, for the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats. So that shows how close and partisan all of these were. And the former one actually was very close to the AfD and even gave the AfD tips on how to avoid spying from his own service. So I really think if people spoke German, they would be a lot more alarmed about German, corruption and infiltration by the far right and repression. I think they're almost protected by their language in a sense from international criticism. And there are a lot of people who have made their careers talking about how great Germany is and how they've learned from their past. And it's something we all wanted to believe, right? And I do think Merkel was a very talented politician and sort of kept Europe and Germany together by depoliticizing. And I think since she's disappeared, actually, a lot of the conflicts which she suppressed through her own force of personality are popping up. One of that is this return to the far right and this question of, listen, if Russia invades the Baltics, let's say, and the AfD are in power, which way is Germany going to go? Is it going to stick with NATO? Is it going to stick with the West? Or is it going to say, hey, we want our cheap gas? Actually, our economy has suffered a lot. That's a big narrative right now. Listen, we don't like what Russia's doing, but we need to keep the lights on.
On that note, I was going to ask you about this classification of the AfD by Germany's spy agency as extremist, which is basically enabling it to step up monitoring of the group. Now, they've described that as a blow against democracy. Do you see that connected to their ideas, to any future power, to their sympathetic stance maybe on Russia? What do you make of this?
The AfD's categorization as domestic extremist is something that probably should have happened quite a while ago, but it happened really late. And, they also challenged it in court and ultimately it's dragged on. And, a couple of years ago now, there were huge protests against the AfD on the streets after there was this plan that leaked, and it was near Wannsee, which is where they planned the Holocaust. There was a conference to plan this final solution, and the AfD was supposedly planning like a mass deportation of non-white people, of migrants. And there was a huge reaction from German civil society there. About 1.5 million people went on the street. So, you can say that's quite admirable. But what I noticed was at the time, all of the organizers and the people weren't actually asking for anything concrete. It was just a kind of mass virtue signaling in a sense. They weren't asking, let's ban the AfD. They were just saying like, this is bad. But ultimately, if you get 1.5 million people on the street, but then 20 million want to vote for the AfD, it doesn't really matter. At the same time, this categorization, I think the domestic intelligence service, the way it worked, from what I've seen of the documentation of the case against them, some of it is quite flimsy, actually. There seems to be this guilt by association in Germany, and that's used against both the far right and the Palestine movement. It's like, well, you have appeared alongside this person on a panel, and this person has said this, and that's problematic. And ultimately, I don't think that works because I think we're all responsible for what we say. It's really flimsy. I don't know if it would hold up up in court. And I think it's a bit late, because when people went out on the street, the AfD were on about 18%. You know, some polls have them on close to 30% now. It's probably too late. The cat's out of the bag, but I don't see any other way to stop it. I don't think that the moving ever further to the right is going to do that. But there are forces within the CDU who are quite interested in doing that. And I think they're actually undermining Friedrich Merz at the moment, particularly Jens Spahn. He's the parliamentary leader of the CDU. And I think he's kind of pivoting to be the great white hope, in a sense, of the right wing of the CDU. But I don't think he even has much chance because he's gay. So he doesn't have the backing of a lot of people. He's also quite close to the Trump administration. He was very friendly with Richard Grenell, who was the German ambassador for Trump and now is quite high up in the MAGA movement. So I do think there is a bit of an international far-right network going on. But with nationalist movements, there's always this question of how far can you get with a nationalist international?
That is the question. And it's a question I want to pose to you in the context of sort of growing what I would call language of violence that we're observing from the right in America, the far right in America, however you wish to characterize the MAGA camp. Are you seeing rising calls for or use of violence in the German context by these far right groups against minority groups that are being themselves labeled by the state as a problem? Because surely that confluence is really dangerous.
There was this conference about, they called it remigration, right? Remigration. And that went from being a very taboo word, because ultimately it means mass deportation of including German citizens, is how it was used in that context. It's kind of been a bit redefined just to mean like mass deportation of illegal immigrants, but it's very much the norm on the far right now. And Germany is now pushing this idea of national pride, of defense, because they do need, you know, they say they need more soldiers so that they can be able to defend themselves. So they're pushing this idea. And at the same time, we're seeing a very much normalization of really, really far-right terminology, particularly remigration, mass deportations. You know, we are seeing it everywhere. But I think the German far-right, some political scientists have said that unlike the Front National, unlike Reform, the big difference with the AfD is they haven't moderated as they've got closer to power. They've actually radicalized, and people still vote for them because people are so fed up of, in part, this elitist system, right? Germany actually has some of the lowest social mobility in the developed world, in Europe, in the OECD. People don't realize that, and it's very much not part of the German self-understanding. They have this almost American idea of, oh, you can make it, or rather than everyone being rich, there's a good life for everyone, you know, which harks back to the post-war economic boom. There were a lot of good jobs around. But it's really hard to rise through the ranks. People don't have political connections. If you don't have political connections in your family, you might not become a politician. There's all these kind of patronage networks through political parties, institutions. And I think people are fed up with that, and they want a counterforce. As well as the rise of the far right, the AfD, there is also now the Left Party, who are doing better than ever. And I have my criticisms of the Left Party. They've been pretty quiet on Gaza until quite recently. They have organised a large protest since then. But I don't think they quite have this oppositional energy that the AfD bring. The AfD really brings this energy of like, we completely disagree with your system and we want to bring it down. And I think that attracts people, actually, because it is a system which is lacking legitimacy. There's huge amounts of inequality, huge amounts misspent, repression, no freedom of speech. Most Germans say there is a freedom of speech problem. This isn't just Palestine supporters. It's a country where, as I said, you can be sued for giving someone the finger.
Yeah.
You can, saying from the river to the sea is counted as a Hamas slogan. There was someone even recently, they had posted a picture from an anti-war demo, which had a red triangle smashing a weapon, like in the picture, and this person is being investigated for support of terrorism because that red triangle is seen as a symbol of Hamas. So really there is a free speech crisis. J.D. Vance was actually right about this, but it's mostly used against the political left.
It's so interesting because I was watching a video yesterday that's gone viral of this comedian talking to himself in this skit where he basically is like, yeah, you know, I can't afford anything. And his friend's like, yeah, I can't afford anything. And like, it's that small group of people who are behind it all. And the other guy's like, yeah, you're right. Like, it's one small group of people that are really like fobbing us off. And, you know, they're agreeing on all of these points until they get to the point where one of them's like, yeah, and it's the migrants. And the other guy's like, no, it's the elites.
Yeah.
And I thought it was such a perfect encapsulation of this issue that we see now. It's true here, it's true in France, it's true in Germany, it's true in America. It's like this nebulous elites thing as it is where a lot of frustration is being derived from, but I still think it's not very clear who we're talking about. And those individuals or groups are directing us towards much clearer targets, which is, of course, migrants, which today is also a byword for Muslims, a byword for Black and brown people, a byword for whatever's going wrong in Europe, right? And the bit that I find astounding is that many of us will remember Merkel welcoming, you know, over 1 million Syrian refugees to Germany. Certainly at the time, I thought it was presented not so much as we're doing them a favor, as Germany needs a workforce. Syrians are actually amongst the most highly educated. You know, there's a big middle class. Like, these are people who actually can come to Germany and integrate and contribute to the economy in ways that we actually need. But there's now a huge pushback against this, right? You mentioned this remigration discourse. You know, they want to send Syrians back to Syria now. How do you explain how you've gone from a country that seemed to recognize the importance, even simply economically, of migration to being now infected by this idea that the far right obviously push, that all migration is hostile, dangerous, bad, and needs to be stopped?
You know, it's not all migration. It's specifically migration from Muslim countries, right? Because now even the AfD were recently complaining about how the Poles are leaving Germany. So for the first time ever, you know, Germany and Poland share a pretty large border. And actually, Poles have started to go back for the first time. And the AfD has complained about this because, the hardworking Poles are going, and now we've got the, you know, lazy Afghans or the lazy Syrians or whatever. Actually, integration into the labor force, most experts say, has been pretty successful, especially for Syrians, because, as you mentioned, it's an educated country, large middle class, a lot of doctors and so on. Actually, looking back, arguably, maybe it was a mistake how Merkel did it, because this was a huge decision to make, right? And she didn't make it in a very democratic way. Of course, it was a kind of emergency situation of people who were just fleeing. And what was the alternative? Was it, you know, closing the Schengen border? Was it shooting at people on the border, which is what the AfD members have said they wanted? But I do wonder, was doing it in such a drastic way something which led in part to this rise of the far right in Europe? Because it's something which kick-started the far right in Poland, France, and also Germany. The AfD, before that decision, were quite a small party, mostly focused on the Eurozone. They were mostly focused on economics. It was even called the Professors' Party back then. So it's actually really radicalized elements of German society who maybe in the past they would have supported the CDU somewhat begrudgingly, particularly in the East. And now they've moved to the far right because also the media pushes this idea of migrant crime, of knife crime. It's still quite low. But I will say, you know, I'm a news reporter. There has been a lot of terrorist attacks in Germany in the last 10 years or so. And I've got a friend who's actually said he's going to vote for the AfD because, you know, 10 years ago before this, there wasn't kind of bollards at Christmas. Obviously, that's a simplification. And I don't agree with him. But I do wonder if this welcome, wir schaffen, as they say, we'll manage, wasn't really so thought out, and if that has led to the far right in Europe. I'm undecided.
Yeah.
But clearly, if there's been such a huge backlash, it wasn't something that didn't come with problems.
What is the greatest source of terrorism in Germany today?
Of course, it is the far right.
Just to clarify, obviously,
Yeah.
because I think, the assumption is always that the word terrorism is also now symptomatic almost of Muslims somehow doing wrong. And I wanted to ask you about that in the context of Islamophobia and how that connects to the discourse of the sort of scapegoating of certain communities as almost holding all of the nation's wrongs within them. Recently, the director of the Anne Frank Center in Frankfurt said AFD is pro-Jew not because they love Jews, but because they hate Muslims. What do you make of that?
I actually have my disagreements with Meron Mendel, but I think he's right about that. And he's picking up on something I wrote about in kind of a long read for the Drop site, new media covering a lot of Middle Eastern conflict. And ultimately, I think the AFD realized quite early on that Zionism and Israel was a fantastic way of pushing their agenda. Right, which is anti-Muslim, it's anti-migrant. So this idea that migrants are anti-Semites and shouldn't be welcome in polite society, they were some of the first to do that. There's a very clear case of this, which was the BDS resolution in the Bundestag, which you've mentioned previously. Ultimately, the AfD said there's too much imported Arab anti-Semitism that is expressed in the BDS, the Boycott, Divest, Sanction Against Israel movement. So we need to ban that. And what the centre parties did, I think this is really illustrative of the whole dynamic, what they said was, listen, this is a really good point, but we can't leave the important fight against anti-Semitism to the far right, because, the far right in Germany is associated with anti-Semitism. If you look at polls, the far right is the anti-Semitic party, right? And the AfD people, their supporters do believe conspiracy theories against Jews, but they realize we can push this idea. That was 2019 that it was passed. It's also a deeply problematic resolution, a bit like Staatsräson. It's not an official ban, but that means you can't challenge it. So universities will ban anyone associated with BDS, but you can't challenge that even though it's not because it's not a law. And then what we've seen is that parties like even the Greens have taken rhetoric from the AfD, and Beatrix von Storch, who is one of the most controversial figures from the AfD, she's friends with Nigel Farage, but she's one of the more radical figures. There was an anti-Semitism resolution last year, which was backed by the Greens, the SPD. It was a sort of centre-left coalition at the time. And it was a resolution that very much links anti-Semitism to criticism of Israel. And she got up in front of the Bundestag and she said, listen, look what we've achieved, because now even the Greens are talking about Arab imported anti-Semitism. They're really proud that they've pushed this discourse. And I think they've been really successful and quite savvy, actually. They've also been supported by elements of the left. There's even pro-Israel far left in Germany called the Anti-Deutsch. So they're really interesting. And ultimately, certain wings from all across society have come together to push this narrative. And I think the AfD are not the only people, but they are very happy with how it's turned out.
But so how is Germany squaring this kind of demonization of minorities yet again, as you say, within living memory of the Holocaust? Anti-Muslim attacks in Germany have jumped from around 900 cases in 2022 to over 3,000 cases in 2024. That's more than a 240% increase in just 2 years. This may sound naive, but I would have thought that a country like Germany would be paying really close attention to how its minorities are being treated. So what is going on?
I think it's almost the opposite. I think ultimately anything that's uncomfortable, they have a bit of a tendency to turn a blind eye to. There's also this phrase in German, blind in the right eye, which means, a lot of security services, police, they kind of don't pay attention to the far right. So I remember quite a few years ago now, seeing a study by, I believe it was Oslo Center on Extremism. And it said that he was actually the place where the most far-right violence happens. But because it's so uncomfortable, there's a bit of a brushing it off. People don't want to see it. They admit that there's a problem, but there's never, you get task forces against illegal migration, against anti-Semitism, but there's no task forces against far-right violence, And there was, especially in East Germany in the 90s, like quite a few pogroms actually against migrants. People are killed quite often. There are fire bombings of apartments. There was one one or two in the last few years where the prosecution has just jumped the gun and said, oh, this wasn't far right. And then the investigation comes out and it finds that, oh, yeah, actually this place where, Roma family was killed, there was actually like a swastika, and maybe it was a far right thing. Or, for example, in Hanau, a city in central Germany, there was a kind of racist terrorist attack where I think 9 or maybe even 11 people were killed. And there were so many clues before that this was going to happen. The guy had written his manifesto's website on walls. He had made threats. Ultimately, I think Germany is not dealing with the far-right threat because it's afraid of admitting that it still exists. And I think that's not just a threat to migrants in Germany, but could be a threat to the rest of Europe as well.
And to what extent do you think that that narrative is being driven by Israel itself? As in, is Israel kind of providing the social cues, the kind of moral cues of this idea that, what Germany needs to focus on is this type of anti-Semitism, which we're defining this way, which also could mean that Jews somehow are anti-Semitic. And also, of course, replicating this narrative that we've heard come out of Israel that somehow Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims are responsible for anti-Semitism, even in Germany, which was at the heart of the Holocaust itself.
So I don't think Israel is the key backer here. I think this is something that comes from deep within German society, this idea that, we need to kind of brush off. And it's a reaction to the guilt, right? I think it must be really hard to deal with the idea that, your grandparents who maybe you loved had actually just brutally murdered hundreds of people, depending on, if your family was in the SS or they had just stood quietly by and as their Jewish neighbors were taken away. I think this shame and this guilt leads to a sort of fractured personality. But one thing I will say about Israel's role in this, of course, they have identified that their best strategy is pushing Islamophobia in the West, anti-migrant sentiment in the West. But the way that the Israeli embassy in Germany acts is really undiplomatic in a sense. They're really pushing a particular narrative, supporting particular pro-Israel journalists, attacking journalists who are more sympathetic to Palestine, and also pushing fake news. They recently said that finally there was a huge demo protest for Gaza in Berlin. It was 100,000 people. It was backed by the left party. It took a long journey for Die Linke, the left party, to get there. And there was there was also a smaller protest a few miles away where there was some kind of glorification of October 7th and Hamas from, some of the participants there. And they actually said, Amnesty International and Die Linke, their demo was pro-October 7th, So really just spreading fake news. And I mean, everyone makes mistakes, but is that a mistake if it's helping to demonize the quite mainstream Palestine solidarity movement?
I'm not an expert on diplomacy, but my understanding is that there's something quite distinct about the role of an embassy versus a lobby group. It seems quite a distinct role to be playing at a time where Israel itself is being investigated for war crimes and genocide. Let me ask you a last question about, you obviously are a journalist, you're a reporter, you work and have been working in Germany for over 8 years now. I saw this tweet by the editor-in-chief of Welt newspaper in Germany, and it said, "Those who want a caliphate in America have the right man in Mamdani." Now, presumably, Welt newspaper is not a far-right paper.
No, it's sort of a right-wing broadsheet. It's owned by Axel Springer, which I mentioned earlier. It's kind of their prestige publication. So they have Welt, which is more broadsheet, and then they also have Bild, which is the tabloid, and they're both highly pro-Israel. And I think it's worth mentioning that when you work for Axel Springer, you actually have to sign up that you agree with Israel, with the transatlantic relationship and some other stuff in the kind of code of conduct. So that's activism, not journalism.
That tweet is clearly Islamophobic from my perspective. It's accusing Zohran Mamdani, who is, of course, the newly elected mayor of New York, of somehow being an extremist who wants to establish a caliphate. How normalized is this kind of discourse about Muslims, and how does it compare to the broader trends that you're seeing within journalism across Europe?
I can only really speak about Germany and the media there, but I do think the media is deeply Islamophobic. I'm not a Muslim myself, but you just see everything about Islamic identity completely problematized. And, I would draw a historical parallel to how they treated the Jews, actually. And that's really taboo to do in Germany because, you're not allowed to compare anything to the Nazis. But I think if you see influential right-wing Germans demonizing a religious minority, then you should be able to call a duck and say, this reminds me of the Nazis. And I think with Islam, there's this term in German that's used a lot, Islamism, which is the idea, maybe the Islam's not problematic, but any kind of political expression of Islam is Islamism, and that's really problematic. And there's actually a huge infrastructure, particularly within academia, but also the media, which reports on any kind of Islamism. Actually, there was a group band I called Generation Islam, and some of their subgroups, because they had called for a caliphate. So the German state has a lot more tools for banning things than many other liberal democracies. I would argue Germany's not as much of a liberal democracy as people might think. And ultimately, they have scapegoated. People talked about after the war, they needed a scapegoat for their suffering, and it was the Jews. I think there's an element of that. I think it's also partly about a kind of racist mass hysteria. And I do think that we are seeing that now about Muslims in Germany, and particularly linked to Palestine, but also just, religious Muslims or whatever. It's completely ahistorical. This idea that, any political expression of Islam is super undemocratic and wrong. But ultimately, I think it's more about the German self-understanding and their imagination of them fighting back against extremism, against the new Nazis, the Islamo-Nazis, which, as I said previously, is similar to the idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, which motivated many of the Nazis' worst crimes. So much of my work is really just tweeting and translating on different platforms what influential Germans say, because I think it is scary and dangerous. I think everyone needs to pay more attention to Germany. It's the most powerful, biggest country in Europe. It has influence in the economy, in the European Union, and also politically, historically as well. So watch out for more.
James Jackson, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of The Tea. We're not here to tell you what to believe. We're here to hold space for honest conversation. If today's episode made you pause or see things differently, please follow us, subscribe, share this episode, and keep the conversation going in the comments below. You can also join us on Patreon for early access, extras, and a say in what stories we tell next. Thanks for keeping independent journalism alive, one listen at a time. Catch you next time. Stay present. Stay questioning. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this episode resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And why not dive into these other episodes we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation going.